The second feature that enables code reuse is called rule sets. Rule sets allows you to combine validation rules together as a logical group and then pick and choose which group to execute and which to ignore. Let's first see this feature in practice. We'll discuss its code reuse capabilities after that. Before we do that, let me remove the code related to the phone number hierarchy. As I said, that was a rather contrived example to showcase the feature of inheritance validation, and we will not be using it further in this course. So here's how we can define a rule set. I'm calling this specific rule set email and putting one of our rules in this set. Now, to employ this rule set in the controller, I need to use an overload of the validate method that accepts an options parameter. But first, I need to import the Fluent Validation namespace. To indicate which rule set to include, I need to call the includeRuleSets method on the options parameter and list all the rule sets I want to employ in the validation. Without such an indication, Fluent Validation will run only the rules that aren't part of any rule set. Let me actually show you that. If I remove the options parameter and run the application, you can see that the rules involving the address collection are still in place, but if I remove the email, the API doesn't return a validation error. That's because the email validation was not invoked. Now let's go back to our code and ask Fluent Validation to include the email rule set. Running the application, if I remove the student's name, you can see that the validation succeeds. And if I omit the email, the API returns an error. So we have the opposite situation here. Fluent Validation invokes the rules in the rule set, but doesn't invoke the rules not in the rule set. This is how the rule sets work in Fluent Validation. If we don't specify a rule set to include in the validation process, then the library only invokes the rules outside of the rule sets that we've defined. And if we do specify a rule set, then the library only invokes the rules from that rule set and nothing else. Behind the scenes, Fluent Validation creates a rule set called default for all rules that are not put in explicit rule sets. And if we want to include these rules in the validation, then we can use the name of that default rule set in the validation options. Alternatively, there is a separate method that allows us to do that. Include rules not in a rule set. Let me put this in separate lines. Okay, let's run the application. If I remove the name now, the API does return us a validation error. That's because the name validation is part of the default rule set, and we explicitly asked Fluent Validation to invoke that rule set. Now let's talk about why we would want to segregate our rules into rule sets in the first place. The reason for this feature is that it enables code reuse. Notice that the register request validator and the edit personal info request validator have a lot in common. Basically, they share the same validation rules, except that the registration request has the additional email field. And so instead of having two separate validator classes, we could introduce just one and then reuse it across the two API endpoints. So let's do that. I'm copying our register request validator and renaming it into student validator. Instead of the register request, this validator will validate a student DTO, which will be accepted by both of our API endpoints. Changing the student validator and updating the controller. Good. Now, instead of their own respective request validators, the two endpoints can use the same student validator. Let's run the application and make sure we didn't break anything. Remove the email. The registration API still returns an error. Good. Let's also try out the edit personal info API. And we actually need to update it since we refactored the single address into a collection of addresses. And I also need to change the student ID because Carl hasn't been registered yet. Very good. The personal info is successfully updated, which means that the edit personal info API endpoint hasn't invoked the email rule set, just as we expected. So this is the rule set feature in action, reusing the same validator in different API endpoints with slight modifications. Both the register and update APIs have most of the rules in common. As for the rules that differ, we can put them into separate rule sets and let the API endpoint decide which of them are needed. We could go even further and be explicit about the purpose of the rule set by renaming it into create or register rule set. We can also have a separate update or edit personal info rule set for rules specific for our second API endpoint. Alright, having that said, I don't recommend that you use this feature. Its usage is a strong sign that you are following the CRUD-based interface anti-pattern. We'll discuss it in more detail in part 2, but in short, try to always make your API task-based, where each API endpoint represents a separate task and defines a separate data contract for that task. Reusing data contracts between API endpoints is a huge red flag. You can learn more about task-based versus CRUD-based interfaces in my CQRS in Practice course. So let me change everything back. Register request validator and edit personal info request validator. I'm also removing the email rule set from here. I'll leave the student validator for your reference. In the previous two demos, we discussed two features of the Fluent validation library: inheritance validation and rule sets. Inheritance validation allows you to set up validation rules polymorphically, meaning assign different sets of rules for each concrete class of the class hierarchy. I don't recommend using this feature because the only way to use it is to validate the domain model classes, not data contracts. This necessarily requires you to transition your domain model into an invalid state before you can validate it. We'll talk more about this anti-pattern when we'll be discussing the topic of the always valid domain model. The second feature, rule sets, allows you to combine validation rules together as a logical group and then pick and choose which group to execute and which to ignore. At runtime, every rule you define belongs to a rule set, even those for which you don't explicitly create a rule set. Behind the scenes, Fluent Validation creates a rule set for all individual rules, called default. When you ask the library to validate an object without specifying a rule set, the library uses that default rule set. If you do specify rule sets yourself, then Fluent Validation will only use those rule sets. If you want to also include the default rule set, you need to explicitly ask Fluent Validation to include it using the separate method. The purpose of this feature is to reuse the same validator class for different API endpoints. The common pattern here is to have a validator that validates a data contract representation of some domain class, such as the student DTO that we used in our example, and then either include or exclude different fields from the validation depending on the particular use case. For example, in our sample project, we don't modify the student email after we register that student, and so the email validation should only be included in the registration API endpoint, but not in the edit personal info API. Therefore, we can leave the rules for name and address without a rule set, and extract the rule for email in a separate rule set. We then invoke the default rule set in both API endpoints, but only include the email rule set in the registration API. You should avoid such a code reuse because it contradicts another important principle that we'll be discussing in part 2 of this course, and that is each of your API endpoints should define their own data contract independently of other API endpoints. You can also learn about this principle in my course CQRS in Practice.